Today we're talking about a very specific topic that has only recently been raising more awareness in the general public in research and advocacy. Fish are the species most consumed, and there's a growing economic demand on all over the world, and we observe also a strategic approach on enhancing production by many governments. And on the other hand, research has increased, but has shown a significant lack of fish welfare and a need for improvement still. So I'm very glad that today we discuss new findings and approaches to this long neglected topic. WTS has engaged in improving education and research on fish welfare in the last years. The project presented by ESR today was funded under the WTS Research Grant. Also, ESR, together with my colleagues, have developed a teaching module on fish welfare within our Vets United program. So I'm very glad that ESR is presenting today. The organization is one of the expert organizations actively working on developing and also implementing solutions, which you will learn about today. And I would like now to hand over to my colleague and co-host, Paul Suna. He is the director of AWECA at Makerere University in Uganda. The Animal Welfare Competence Center for Africa is a public-private partnership being supported by WTS and WTG to collect and promote animal welfare knowledge on the African continent. Paul has been a long-term partner of WTS. He has set up our university training program, Vets United in Uganda, and he has also developed the guidelines for animal welfare in development cooperation, and he has been our host since the beginning of this series. So I would like to invite Dr. Paul to introduce our first guest. Over to you.
Thank you, Karen, for introducing the webinar, the topic that we are going to be handling today, and also for those kind introductions. I also want to join in welcoming our participants today. So I will introduce our speaker for today, who is Wasseem Emam. He is an aquatic ecologist and fish welfare researcher with over 16 years experience across the fisheries and aquaculture sector. And in 2021, he founded Ethical Seafood Research with the aim of bridging gaps between farmed aquatic animals, food systems, and on-the-ground practice. Under his leadership, ESR collaborates with partners across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East to develop science-based practical approaches that embed welfare considerations into aquaculture systems, and also to support sustainable, context-appropriate change. Wasseem's work draws on field research, training initiatives, and multi-stakeholder engagement to connect research, policy, and implementation. So you're welcome, Wasseem, to give your presentation.
So as Dr. Paul mentioned, I'm Wasseem Emam. I'm the Director of Ethical Seafood Research, or ESR as we're known, and I'm also a researcher at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine and Complutense University Madrid in Spain. That's where I'm based. We are an applied research and implementation organization, and we work very much at the interface of both aquaculture practice and training, and the animal welfare is a big component of that. And our main projects in the last few years have been mostly in Africa, as well as the Middle East and Egypt, where I'm from originally, and I'll talk a bit about that. And what I really hope to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is share how we've been working, moving from not just assessing animal welfare to actually improving it. So we're talking about the real world aquaculture systems and drawing on field experience from countries where we operate, primarily Egypt and Kenya for this talk. And what we're trying to do is bridge that gap between animal welfare science and day-to-day practice. So what we've seen is that in the areas where fish are farmed, the largest numbers, the topic of fish welfare and even actually animal welfare more generally is not part of the conversation when we talk about production. So that's a gap that we've been working to fill. And moving to assessments, what I want to point out at the start is that in the global south, we're starting from a very basic baseline. So some of the practices that I'll refer to today might look like, standard best practice in more industrialized systems in the global north, but in the global south, it's really working on shift from thinking and behavior. That the starting point really matters about, starting from a very basic baseline. So that affects how we design assessment tools, how we engage with farmers, and ultimately whether the tools that we're developing actually end up being realistic and sustainable beyond just, a single project. And that's something I'm going to try to emphasize today. So when we talk about assessing animal welfare in African aquaculture, the first thing to emphasize is that actually it's not the problem is not a lack of concern or a lack of effort on the part of producers or farmers. We see it more as a structural mismatch. So many of the frameworks that exist to assess animal welfare, a lot of them are like, for example, in the WTS module that Karen mentioned. These are all tools that are designed. Initially were designed for, let's say salmon or trout farming in the global north, and what we try to do is adapt them to systems where there's much less standardization, less regulation, and you can see even many farmers don't keep records, which makes it harder to use the indicators that come with these welfare assessments. So that's the context I wanted to provide. And again, we're talking about environments that tend to be very heterogeneous. The inputs tend to be fluctuating. The environment can be variable, and of course, there's economic constraints that we have to keep in mind. So when we apply assessment tools that were not designed for the reality of the global south, we see two things happening. Either that these tools give us data that then doesn't end up being particularly useful for decision making, or the recommendations or a pathway that can move the producer to improvement. If we look at this from a farmer's perspective, that can quickly feel like, just another burden or something they have to do. They don't always see the clear benefit. And from a donor's perspective, we can see, welfare assessments or assessments of farm practices. They look good on paper, but they don't actually translate into real world changes. So that's why in our work, assessment isn't really the end in itself. It's just a starting point. What we really want to see is, an assessment approach that helps farmers and farm managers, technicians, and so on make better decisions and improve system performance over time. So once you move past the high-level framing that I mentioned, the challenges become actually very practical. So many of the farmers that we work with, for them, maybe the concept of animal welfare isn't explicitly named or conceptualized. They're more familiar with things like survival, growth rates, disease outbreaks, the cost of feed. These are things that, they are very familiar with and aware of, but they all obviously have links to welfare, So we have to always make that link so we don't see it as a separate objective. And then there's also this issue of trade-offs. So farmers obviously are faced with competing pressures, stocking density versus growth, how much to feed versus water quality, handling stress versus, the need to grade or sort the fish or even harvest them at the end. So without any clear guidance, animal welfare can lose out because the costs of making those changes take time to see. So the benefit isn't always immediately obvious. And then there's this lack of feedback. So farmers try something new. We recommend adjusting feeding, reducing handling, carrying out more frequent water changes, but it takes some time to really see how that can improve welfare. So that's another thing that we have to work on a lot, is how do we provide feedback on how those changes are helping. So if we take those changes together, we can then understand why good intentions aren't enough to improve outcomes. So despite those challenges, what we've actually seen is that if you approach it in the right way, you can implement sustainable change. So one of the key lessons that we've learned is that we have to use simple indicators, and they have to be things that are observable. So producers or farmers can engage with concepts that they understand and recognize. So behavior is something that we've had a lot of success with, and that's obviously a component of animal welfare. So behavior during feeding, abnormal swimming behavior during any part of the production cycle, things like injury rates, looking at fish condition. These are much more easy to relate to than an abstract score or a complex protocol, which is something that my colleague John might touch upon in his presentation after. And then the second factor is how to integrate these welfare assessment frameworks or indicators into daily routine. So it has to be something that is not an extra task, but actually slots in quite nicely into current practice. So, feeding, grading, routine checks at pond side or cage side. So if assessment becomes part of what farmers already do, what we've seen is that uptake and consistency across time improve dramatically. And finally, again, this point about the benefit for farmers, we have to always link it to things like reduced mortality, more uniform growth, and better management or easier management, improvement in product quality, and that's the hard part to sort of make the case for that. So when welfare improvements align with outcomes that farmers truly care about, they're much more likely to be sustained in the long term. So what works is not just having sophisticated implementation or assessment frameworks, but it's really something that fits. So it has to fit to the context, it has to fit to the capacity of the farmers in practice, especially small scale farmers that we're talking about, like maybe a couple of ponds in their back of their house, and it has to fit to their priorities as well. And one of the biggest risks in this space is that improvements disappear right after the projects end. So, for example, we're funded for 1 or 2 years to carry out a certain project, and after we've left, we find that certain practices haven't stuck. So, what we've done in order to address that problem is try to reinforce through routine. So practices that are good for welfare and good for the farmer, we tie them to things that farmers do every day. So not just special activities that are outside of that. So making a habit, let's say, for example, we've provided water quality monitoring equipment to farmers in Egypt and trained them on how to use it, and then followed up with them. And over time, we found that they actually end up getting really interested. Oh, wow, if I do this, actually, this parameter changes. Oh, and I actually noticed this cycle that the fish when we at the end of the cycle look different, and these are the kind of things that motivate them to continue certain habits. And then that leads me to that point of local ownership. So for change to be durable, it has to be reinforced by the farm owners or managers themselves, or even technicians that visit the farms, or local leaders or actors like extension officers that visit farms. So when it's something that they see the value in themselves, it makes it a lot easier to sustain that rather than being an externally driven thing by NGOs such as ourselves or donors. So the last point there is just that there has to be a signal that progress is being maintained, and I think that's where the FAI Tilapia Welfare app that we've been working with a lot has been helpful. Is that it gives a score and it gives a way of tracking. So it helps in as opposed to constant auditing or someone externally looking at it, you see yourself how things are changing. So trends like mortality, behavior, condition, these are things that farmers both recognize and care about. So if you look at all these elements together, they shift welfare from something that happens during a project to actually just something that happens as part of how a system operates. And the experiences that I've talked about really have clear implications for those that design and fund aquaculture projects and animal welfare projects as well. We tend to equate rigor with complexity, that it has to have something very complicated and sophisticated, but actually in this context, the opposite is true. So if we use an approach that's well adapted to local capacity and we use simple frameworks, we find that they're implemented more consistently. And then we also have a strong focus on developing new tools, guidelines, or standards. Like for example, we have a project on a code of practice that we're developing, but we've seen in other contexts where these standards or code of practice exist, but there's hardly any uptake. And if there's no uptake or enforcement or follow-up, and it ends up becoming a reporting exercise or just something that exists without really being a driver of change. So if we care about lasting impact, we need to think beyond the timelines of a specific project, and we need to support mechanisms for learning, for adaptation, and also reinforcement after the end of the project. And that's really the key to our approach on the ground. So to summarize, just progress depends less on innovation and more on alignment between tools, people, and systems. I'll just end with one simple point. Assessment on its own doesn't improve animal welfare. So if we want to improve animal welfare, we have to look at how we change decisions, behaviors, and priorities on a day-to-day basis. So in this case, it's not the tool itself that's helpful. And in the context of African aquaculture, where we see very diverse systems and where there's a lot of constraints farmers face, the success of an assessment approach really how to judge that is not by how comprehensive and sophisticated it is, but whether it actually helps people act differently. And that's the behavior change component of our work. So if we design assessment tools with that goal in mind, it can definitely be a powerful bridge between science and practice, or policy even. If we don't have that in mind, it just becomes another layer of reporting, and we don't find lasting impact, which is not what we're looking for at all. So that's the lens through which we approach this work. So just before I hand over to my colleague John to talk about some of the findings from our WTS funded project in Kenya, I'll just finish by saying thank you to WTS for the invitation and for also creating space for these discussions around animal welfare, especially in a development context, and now for fish welfare, which is, as Karen mentioned, a newer addition.
Hi everyone, and my name is Nyambane. I am a sociologist and tech-driven aquaculture research coordinator with Ethical Seafood Research. I'm also a research fellow with the Interdisciplinary Network for Technology and Entrepreneurship Research in Africa and the New Roots Institute. Today, I will be sharing insights from our WTS-funded Kenya Fish Project and highlighting key knowledge gaps among farmers, how we are using technology and training to address these gaps, and the role of local leadership in scaling impact. My goal is to show how practical tools, data, and a strong partnership can improve fish welfare while enhancing productivity, sustainability, and livelihoods. Our field work with small farmers, tilapia welfare farmers in Kenya, that's the Great Lake region, they feed several gaps that can undermine fish welfare projects if they are not well addressed at early stages. And one of them was fish welfare was largely invisible at farm level. Many farmers did not previously see welfare as something that could be measured or managed, meaning problem often was unnoticed until the time they see mortality happening is when they started realizing the importance of taking consideration of the fish welfare. Second, water quality management was a major gap that we realized from our fieldwork. Routine monitoring of dissolved oxygen, pH, and turbidity was limited among most of the farmers. And if in the cases where they were measuring, farmers often struggled to interpret the results or link them to fish behavior and the health of the fish. The third issue that we identified was that the fish welfare was frequently viewed as an ethical concern rather than a productive driver. Farmers could not really link how the fish welfare could lead to the production or increase the overall take-up of the fish welfare. Then the other thing we also identified was an inconsistency in biosecurity and the weak record keeping among the farmers. The ability to learn from their system to improve over time was a major issue. The way the research addressed these gaps, the project addressed these gaps by pairing digital tools with practical field-based training. That's we trained over 200 farmers across Kisumu, Kakamega, and the Kisii counties, being a representative of the entire Great Lake region of the Kenyan, and participated in hands-on demonstration in the field, focusing on welfare indicators, the water quality management, biodiversity, and record keeping. The 5-up welfare was central in this one. That is what we were using to train the farmers. And many farmers, it was the first time they were receiving such a structured tool to enhance the fish welfare, and they appreciated it a lot using their conditions. The app also helped to translate the welfare science into practical management actions that they could really have control of and see how it is applicable. The training also emphasized on the interpretation and decision making, not just extracting the data, but using it for the betterment of the fish welfare. Farmers learned how welfare indicators relate to growth, survival, and productivity. Many of the farmers that we interacted with, they also reported early detection of the problems, such as low oxygen or poor growth, and this allowed the fast response and reduction of the loss that they were incurring. Local and county leadership also played a very critical role in amplifying our project and making it possible. The work was implemented with the county government, fisheries officers, extension agents, Kenya Marine and Fishery Research Institutes, and the University of Nairobi, what created the legitimacy and the farmer trust, making it easy with the well-coordinated efforts by all stakeholders. Extension officers acted as trusted intermediaries and were trained alongside the farmers, embedding welfare monitoring into existing systems that they were using already in continuing the piloting. The leadership also enabled to scale the welfare data contribution to evidence-based aquaculture planning, aligning with the Kenya's pro-economy strategy, and help position fish welfare as a driver of productivity, sustainability, and food security, not only in Kenya, but also across the African context. I will conclude by thanking all of you for listening to me. Thank you so much.